we try to show in this movie, that when we talk about city development, smart city development, it's about people in the end. I mean, and it's about learning, it's about healthcare, food, energy, and everything. And technology plays a role in that, but only when you combine it with the people using it. So that's what we basically tried to show, and that hopefully we did. And now I'm very happy to really start the program basically with the global inspiration part of things. And I'm very happy we have, well, 3 or actually 4 distinguished guests to join us in this session. Actually yesterday we had a discussion who of them had most air miles, and I think Nick Villa won because he had all the little houses that KLM has combined basically. So I think he was the winner in most air miles. So Nicola is used to be heading up the city collaboration department within in Cisco, and now is their managing director for big data. So Nick, welcome on the stage. Secondly is Dan Hill. Dan Hill is the founder of iFabrica, and well, you've been writing quite a few books and articles lately about the smart citizens. So it's not only about bricks and buildings and urban planning, but it's the smart citizen you will talk about, well, I would say one of the front runners in this thinking. And then is Robin Reed, who works for the World Economic Forum, who's heading up the urban development department, working with all cities in the world, doing research, very busy at the moment, so we're very happy that he's here preparing for DEFO, which is by the end of January this year. And then the moderator is, well, I would say, our one and only Dirk van der Woude, who is responsible for connectivity in the city as policy maker. And Dirk is also known as the guy when internet is not working, Wikipedia is not working, you can always call Dirk. And that's very handy. I'm not sure if I would be very happy to be in a panel with him, because I'm pretty sure the facts and figures are in pretty good hands. So thank you for being here. Hopefully you can help us give inspiring examples from things that happen in the world related to Amsterdam. And Dirk,
okay,
please go.
Thank you. First, see, does it work? You all hear me? Okay. Welcome. Robin, we just met.
Yes.
Great to have you. And I'll try to moderate this way that we'll have a discussion between 4, but with all of you. So be prepared. Some of you I will ask a question directly with your name. If I recognize you with the light, it's right strong. So be prepared to say what you have to say. I have been reading Dan Hill's new essay, Dark Matter and Trojan Horses. You can buy it at Amazon, $3.99. So for Europeans it's a bit cheaper.
It's a bargain.
I didn't finish it, Dan, but I'd like to read a quote from it. We need in particular to find causes of action to address climate change, healthcare, social services, education, fiscal policy and local economic development within a globalized economy. We need to find a way of moving forward without certainty, without prescribed causes of action or existing best practice. We need to find a way of addressing and building on the many positive aspects of recent protests, while fixing or removing the core system faults that they are predicated upon. We may need to redesign many of our existing models of public service provision without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and recognizing the folly and inadvertently returning or recovering to the ideologies that got us into the mess in the first place. Okay, and I was set to have some figures in my head. Yesterday, I was looking at the air quality in Shanghai. And I was comparing it to the message quite recently here in Europe. 25 particles of fine dust per million is still very bad for your health. That's the European norm. In Shanghai at the moment it's 500. So then what's happening to this planet?
That's a big question.
Yeah, exactly. Let's start at the planetary scale.
Yeah.
I think we all know what's happening, I suspect. We have enough data, it's pretty clear what's happening. The question is what we do about it. I just read a very scary book called 10 Billion by Stephen Emmett. I don't know if anybody else has read it, but he's the head of Microsoft Research in the UK, but runs a very interesting kind of interdisciplinary lab. It's not sort of typical Microsoft research, if you see what I mean. And it's one of the scariest books I've ever read. And I've probably read all of the Stephen King books, so that's saying something. because it really does describe the mess that we are in. And he talks about by 2070, the planet being in a state that is really equivalent to what you just described in terms of that difference between our understanding of air quality in, say, Amsterdam and Shanghai. The entire planet will have a similar order of magnitude series of problems unfurling for many of the species that live on it, us included, of course. So we'll be dealing with very, very severe challenges over the next 70 years or so. At the same time, we have immense opportunities as well. My core point underlying that quote, which I should rewrite, I realize now that you've read it out, is that we can't go on addressing them in the same way that we have done. If we're to take advantage of the opportunities or deal with the challenges. Because I think, as Einstein said, you can't use the same tools that created the problem to also fix it. And climate change was created by the tools of, let's say, 18th, 19th century administration and commerce models and so on, the way we've decided to organize our society, which worked well for a couple of hundred years, but now we have to deal with that. So my starting point is always, as I'm a designer, and for too many years, design has just been thought about in terms of the things, the building or the tram or the chair. But what we're interested in now is, well, how do you design the conditions that produce the building or the tram or the chair? That kind of stuff, which is why it's beginning to cross over with policy and all kinds of things. So how do we redesign the institutions? How do we redesign the way that we've decided to run this place to deal with that problem? I know that we have to do that in a 21st century way. We have to think, what does the 21st century municipality look like? Not in terms of what you see in the video, because that's all great, but literally, what does the council look like? Like, what departments does it have? I was just chatting before with Martin. What job titles are there? Who's working there? How do they work? Is it a culture of collaboration, or is it something else? That, I think, is the biggest challenge we have. How do we redesign the way that we've decided to run the place?
Robin, you have been active in China and working with World Economic Forum. You have a unique position to look from above. What do you think is happening in China, and are people in the street in China involved in trying to change this 500 parts per million?
I think in China, what you're seeing quite a lot of is a press to find new models that integrate citizens and the private sector. But these really conflict with the way that things have been done in China for many years. So it's been a very top-down approach. And so what we've been doing is working with different Chinese cities to try out this approach. We find that cities are sometimes reluctant to bring in these outside stakeholders into what is a very top-down process, but that when the World Economic Forum offers to sort of draw upon its international network of global leaders, industry leaders, experts, and the like, that we put the condition on that local stakeholders must also be a part of that process. So it's sort of offering a carrot in order to incentivize a more robust discussion with all different stakeholders. And I think what you're starting to see is that an uptake on the idea that new solutions, more innovative solutions, can come out of the process when you bring in a more diverse audience. And so another problem that China has struggled with is that the way that people interact is very difficult to say no. You'll lose face if you say no to someone. So you tend not to get a lot of dispute in public. And so the internet and new forms of social media have actually changed that quite a bit. So there's a new application, a mobile phone application called the Hey Wei City app. And that actually enables people, citizens, to give input to their cities without publicly disagreeing with the way that their cities are running themselves. So they can sort of hide behind this technological backdrop, which is actually an advantage in this case. So I think that you're starting to see a lot of new experimentation. The way that ecology and technology have so far been looked at has been in a very contained way. So you see a lot of eco-city projects or smart city projects that are in sort of a special economic zone type thing. So I think that the next step is really integrating these concepts in a broad way across the city.
Okay. Nicola, Robin mentions that ICTs, the new way of ICTs, mobile, bring out new ways of involvement of people, public on the street. You are with one of the biggest ICT companies of the world. Have been traveling a lot, I understand. What's your view on that? Is that what Cisco and your colleagues are doing part of the way we're going to save the situation?
Well, save is a big word. I have somehow, I agree with you, a privileged position in the sense that I'm traveling a lot. I'm working with many countries, many public and private sector organizations. And I get to see basically quite a bit of trends, right? And part of our work is to basically spot those trends and drive those, as we call, market transition. I'm an economist by background, so I look at that with an economic type of lens. And if you think about it, this moment, anywhere you go into any city in the world, be it in the developed or developing worlds, what we see and what I see is that not only we as people are getting connected with mobile phones, but also every element of the built environment is getting connected to the network, right? Mm-hmm. A brick, a bus, a cow outside the city. So there's basically billions and billions of sensors which are basically being deployed at the moment. And I think it was 18 months ago where we had more connected objects than people in the world. Now, all these objects are basically starting to produce lots of data, right? Today, we store 94% of the data we produce, yet we only use 4%, right? So we create all this data out of those sensors, we put this data somewhere, we don't know how to retrieve this data, how to use it, and how to make, as a consequence, our citizen intelligence. It just sits there. So what we think about on our side is to say, can we move away from this discussion from a technology perspective being Internet of Things, right? Objects talking to each other, about what, by the way? And can we put people and processes at the center of this equation? So it's not about whether my washing machine talks to my car, but basically what do I do with the information that this data produce and change my life and the world in this perspective in a positive way. So there's a couple of trends there in the Internet of Things era. One is the people are becoming centric in this new platform, right? We are now, in my opinion, the third phase of the internet. We had a commercial one, we had the social networking one, now we have the industrialization of the internet. Second, what we see is that data is basically becoming more and more data in motion, right? So you don't create data in a part of the city and you bring it back into the data center, but data flows around the network. And this allows you to do a couple of things. First of all, it allows you to bring intelligence at the edge of the network. So we are moving away from a centralized command and control data-driven society where data comes into the center, you store it, and then after maybe 1 year you retrieve it if you can find the data and use it for some intelligent decision. But data basically stays at the edge. And this first trend is enabled by the way technology-wise sensors are working. Sensors are becoming more and more energy efficient. So in Nice, we are now deploying parking sensor that lasts with a battery for like 15 to 20 years. Sensors are also becoming context aware. They know where they are, they know where the temperature is, they know if somebody's passing by. And also the CPU, the computing capability of those sensors is increasing. Mm-hmm. So your algorithm, your intelligence can be brought at the sensor level instead of staying into a data center. You bring the information and the intelligence to the data instead of bringing the data to the intelligence. That's the first trend. The second trend, however, is the cloud as a new as a business model is making us rethink about how we provision technology to any type of end user. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, the model in the IT industry for the last 25 years was that a large corporation or a small company will create a product by investing in R&D, will look for a client, will send the client the product, will upsell a service, a technical support service for the next couple of years. So if your product was $1 million, it actually costed $2 million. People, salespeople in the organization would just give each other a big high five. They will go back into the room, recreate a new product, or develop new features of the product and resell it again. Right? It was a transactional technology consumption model. Now, cloud is basically destroying this model. With cloud, basically, consumers, being large enterprises or an end user, can consume technology by the drink. Think about the way we use our iPhones. We don't buy 2,000 applications. We buy an application at the moment that we need it, right? So in this way, you develop a couple of effects. First of all, from an enterprise and government perspective, you reduce your consumption gap. Think about your PC today. Think about how many features are in there and how many do you use. You probably use 5 to 10%. And you still pay for 90% of that type of technology. So now you start thinking about, can I only consume what I use and pay for what I use, and therefore extract value from the technology that really drives my change, being an economic change for enterprise, being a social change for a government organization, being a lifestyle change for a consumer, right? So that's the first big change. The second change to me is cloud breaks the whole traditional relationship between the public sector, the private sector, and the citizens, right? Think about the way public sector is procuring technology today. There is a classic, I would say, 19th century process with a procurement officer that basically buys based on what is the price of this product. Nobody think about how much value can extract from the price, and nobody think about, do I really need this type of features? Now we're changing into a new world where you really, as a CIO of an organization, I talked to a couple of them last week in the US, you don't control anymore what your users do. Your users, your end users in the enterprise, in the government in this perspective, use any type of application they want. They don't basically comply to what the government says. Your citizens do the same, right? You have those famous projects when the city sets up a $2 million fund to create a personal travel assistant, and basically ask a large company or a small company to basically develop this application that they think the users are going to use, and meanwhile there's 25 apps coming up in 3 days, basically doing exactly the same for a fraction of the price. So again, this new Internet of Everything and cloud break the traditional relationship between the public and the private sector, and the third sector and the consumers and the community starts building application and services on top of a sandbox, which is an infrastructure that still government and businesses need to develop. So the question really is, how do you rethink about the way government and businesses work from an infrastructure development perspective, which is what you still need, but the application innovation is basically crowdsourced and run by the community through all the techniques and things that we know about, crowdsourcing, co-creation, open data, open innovation. These are all things that basically enable this new world.
Dan, you said we have now to design for the surroundings in which what you want to design, how to reach that situation. If you hear Nicola, could you reflect on that? Does it connect to what you say, or you say, well, it's an extra dimension?
No, yeah, I agree with almost all of it.
That's good.
The thing I find interesting, I mean, is what isn't there at the moment is then where does that leave government? So, and how does that feel? So if I was, what I want to make sure is that I think the municipality, say, as cities, is a very important structure within our society, economy at the moment, more important than ever, I suspect, and becoming increasingly important again. So we're seeing a shift, perhaps in power from national to urban scale, across all kinds of levels. And I think the same applies to government. And I think the civic municipality is one of humankind's great inventions. I think it's a profoundly important institution. And what I don't want it to end up in, or rather I don't think it should end up in, is to just be a supplier of data services or a component in a cloud. Because I think there's an important sort of philosophical role to it, and there's an important cultural role that it plays. And I think actually we just have to be careful that that we find a role, an innovative role for government still, that's still maintained. So for me, one of the most interesting projects going on in government anywhere, having said what I just said, is at the national level in the UK, the Government Digital Service which is inside the Cabinet Office, which is kind of the core of the UK civil service, the core of the UK government, traditionally one of the dullest areas of government. And that happens to now have in it probably the most interesting startup in the UK, running inside government, fully public funded government employees working in a very contemporary 21st century way. They're rebuilding the government's website at a rate of knots. It's called the gov.uk project. They're taking what were previously thousands of different government websites built by separate departments all over the place, as you can imagine a country of 60 million people might do over the last 15 years or so, and they're combining them into one domain, and they're doing it with all of the techniques that we know about how to make websites now. And interestingly, government ministers in the UK are of a certain level of experience and age and comfort with the internet now that they can just say to the minister, Minister, we're going to make the government website the same way that Amazon makes Amazon, or that Twitter builds Twitter. And the government minister is able to say, oh yeah, I use Amazon, it was really good. 10 years ago, you couldn't have had that conversation. Impossible. So I'd argue that for maybe 20 years, and with all due respect to anybody in the room involved in procurement, most ministers have been buying things they did not know about when it came to IT. They just didn't understand what they were buying quite often, as Nick points out. They weren't thinking of it in terms of investment. They were thinking of it in terms of a cost, a procurement cost. And now you have a generation, and it's not to do with age, it's just to do with experience, that do use Twitter, do use Facebook, do use Amazon, and yes, they are robust, secure. They're secure enough to have everybody in the room's credit card, I'm sure, and we're comfortable with that. They can be built incredibly quickly. And so from a government point of view, this team of maybe, now it's maybe like 200 people, but it started about 30 or so, about 2 years ago, has made massive cost savings for the UK government. I mean, we're talking probably hundreds of millions of pounds or euros, order of magnitude of savings, by taking back what was previously outsourced to large IT consultancies, more on the software side, not Cisco, and bringing it back in-house. So this is a complete reversal of what's been happening in the last couple of decades, particularly in the UK, of course. An in-house small team working in a contemporary way has been making a far better service for a lot less money. I mean, there's an unbeatable hand if you're a public servant. Immensely better service, huge cost savings. So I think that's a very interesting thing that is maybe the thing I'd add to Nick's description, that there is an innovative role for government as a service provider still, and it's important because the platform, as we now know, is where the value is. And that's the direct relationship with citizens. You don't want to outsource that if you're a government. Just like Apple don't outsource the design of their products, and could outsource the design, of course, but it's so core that Jonathan Ive sits on the board. So you've got to really understand, where do we want to have the relationship with citizens? And that's a government's primary role, in a sense. If you think about it, that's where, sorry to use Apple again, but iTunes is that platform. By owning the platform, Apple stays incredibly powerful. The music industry is suddenly not so powerful. And I don't want the government to become like the music industry, just a supplier of data to a platform that belongs to someone else. And the interface with citizens is somewhere else. So I think in all of the picture that Nick describes, there's an important strategic point from a government point of view. Where do you want to be? And we don't want the idea that all the innovation is done in the private sector and by citizens, but I think innovation can happen within the public sector as well. So that's the extra note that I'd add to a picture that I otherwise agree with.
Robin, what are your views on that?
So I agree with Dan that the municipal structure is an incredibly important structure. But traditionally, the way that it's been set up, it's not allowed to have the most productive relationship it can with the private sector and with citizens. So for centuries, the role of the municipal government has been to build roads and collect waste, but today cities are at the forefront of the most pressing global problems. So they're not only picking up waste and maintaining roads, but they're now facing issues like climate change and resilience. These are tremendously large problems. And we really need the private sector involved, and we need citizens involved to co-create solutions and co-implement solutions. And but procurement has been, as I agree, has been a key limitation applications. So the way that cities have traditionally solved their problems is first by identifying the problem and then making sort of a laundry list of all the products and services they need to address that problem. And the problem is that with that approach, you have a traditional relationship between the private sector and cities that's a vendor-client type relationship. And with citizens, it's sort of a service provider-receiver relationship. And we need new structures that enable those relationships to change. I want to highlight a few models where I think that actually those models are changing. The first, in New York City, actually where I live, there's a competition called Big Apps. And it's a city-sponsored competition that opens up the city's data and then allows entrepreneurs to come in and develop a mobile application which solves an urban challenge of New York City. So in a sense, the city is actually getting around procurement because the city is able to offer a new service to its citizens without having to buy anything at all. So Roadify is a product of that. So this is an application that was developed in 2011. And essentially, Roadify provides real-time information off the back of city data to New Yorkers to find out who want the latest information on when the subway is going to arrive and what road conditions are. And the winner, or the developer of that mobile application, not only won the prize money, but he also had a market-ready solution that he could then go and make money off of. And he had attracted a tremendous amount of venture capital because the city acted as a platform to sort of advertise this new mobile application. A second example is actually Mexico City. So Mexico City had a major traffic congestion problem. It still does, but it recognized that a part of it was due to delivery trucks and the logistics industry taking their trucks through the city. The city had a couple options there. It could have sent out a request for proposal and looked for a consultant to advise on how it could solve the problem. In the same way, it could have purchase new technologies. But instead, the city made its traffic data available to the logistics industry, and the logistics industry accesses that data on an ongoing basis and can make decisions about how to more efficiently move its trucks through the city. So again, the city completely avoided the procurement process in that instance. Singapore is an example of a city that's actually drawn very well on its citizens. So every so often, Singapore will hold sort of what it's called an urban prototyping lab, which essentially is a hackathon which brings in citizens, invites citizens to come in and think about new ways that the city can use technology to solve some of its urban problems. So, for example, in one weekend, it will bring together 250 citizens, and that actually, over a weekend, that's about 3,000 man-hours that the city doesn't have to pay for. And in a given weekend, those citizens will come up with between 10 and 30 different solutions. The city itself doesn't implement those solutions. Rather, it floats those solutions to the private market to see if anyone wants to co-invest. So I think you're seeing some really interesting new models of how cities can work around this procurement problem. And really what it shows is that if a city creates a defined problem space, as opposed to partially writing the solution in an RFP, then this can create a lot of space for innovation by the private sector or by citizens. And what you're finding is that it's really redefining the traditional relationships between the city, the private sector, and citizens so that they interact in new ways.
Right.
Can I
Yes, of course.
just add something to that? I mean, I think it's these are all great examples, and we need 1,000 more like this, or 1 million more like this. And then the next step is then, how does that then change the way that we think about the function of government, so that you really start dealing with this? Yes, it's, as you described, Robin, we used to have this very traditional planning-led approach. We know what the problem is, we then procure the solution, it will happen, then we move on to the next problem. And we know that the world is just too complex for that now, it's too interdependent. You can't, say, get the Department of Health to solve healthcare anymore, because it's clearly also to do with planning, or energy, or most of the other departments as well. And all the possibilities are there as well. Houses can produce energy, not just consume energy. So can vehicles. So you can't then have the Department of Energy, the Department of Transport, Department of Housing run independently. You know, so there's that second step, I think, and I think Thomas Ilves, the president of Estonia, talks about when you shift from that 19th century mode of bureaucracy driven through paper, which kind of defines the way the organization works. When you change the thing that the organization works with from paper to data, you have to redesign the government. So, and I think, and the way that it works, so this culture change you're talking about, Robin, is profoundly important. The shift to working in this more collaborative mode with businesses and citizens and so on. And I think Martin Heyer might talk about it later, but he talks about radical incrementalism in his great Energetic Society paper. The idea that you have to shift then from this kind of planning mode to this something which is much more collaborative, interrogative, incremental, prototype-led, iterative. And that is a radical shift. So radical incrementalism is a nice way of thinking about it. And I think, again, it's a hugely innovative and positive shift for the public sector, actually, which otherwise sees itself backed into a corner.
If I may add on top.
I have a question to you.
Okay.
I have a question to you. Then is, I translate it, saying that the American way of planning perhaps is not the way forward.
It's also
It's
the European.
Well, so to Slowanism, General Motors, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So, you as an Italian living in the Netherlands, if you think in your mind, bringing into practice what Dan says to Italy, what are your views?
Well, I guess I know what you're asking me.
From planning to incremental.
I guess I know you're asking me the question. A good friend of mine is just been appointed the leader of the Democratic Party in Italy.
Matteo Renzi.
And he's trying to change some big things there. Now, first of all, in Italy, there's two things, and I was talking to Matteo a couple of weeks ago, that you need to think about. One is you need to change education, right? The education system is the basis for us to basically weather and go through this crisis. I will argue what Italy is going through now basically is a cultural and generational issue, right? It's not going back to a specific politician or to a specific party or to a specific group. It's basically a structural issue that we have that you have to address basically by looking first, in my opinion. And Matteo Sinstobino was speaking about it the other day, through education, right? You live in Italy, you know basically how squandered this education system is and how basically, I don't say old century, but 2 centuries ago that is. If I look at the way my kids go to school here and my nephews do it in Italy, it's a completely different world, truly. The second piece to me in Italy is basically infrastructure. We've been discussing about broadband for the last 15 years. We are still one of the laggards there. Yet, we are one of the countries in the world with the highest percentage of Facebook users, right? So it's not that the Italians are not really IT savvy or looking for this type of technology. It's just that the technology discussion has been a government and large corporation discussions in Italy, and they basically got hostage of political circles and political issues. The Dutch basically 15 years ago decided they wanted to have fiber, and you just moved and did it, right? You did it in a much better way,
or less
quicker way than what we did. So infrastructure and education, to me, are two of the major elements in Italy that basically drive the generation and cultural change that the country needs. I'd like to go back, however, to the issue of local government. There is one element which is basically policy and smart regulations that we haven't touched on. And I'll give you an example. Together with a partner that we have, a large lighting company, which you can think about in terms of name. About a year ago, we were basically pitching to the CEO of a Southern European large city the idea of IP-enabled lighting. So we went with our nice pitch about how the network and lights come together and the lighting system become intelligent. And in the middle of the pitch, this gentleman showed us and said, no, wait a second. I don't want to buy any more routers and switches from Cisco and luminaries from this other company. Can you sell me light? I want to buy light. And can you sell it to me in a way which is a decision I can take to switch on my lamppost at 2 in the morning if Dirk van der Wade works at home and we know that he feels comfortable to have light 8 meters before the lamppost and 12 meters after that. Can you sell me that? So we went back into our lab and we created the whole infrastructure, technology, business models. Yet we are stuck because of procurement issues. The government is not able to buy light. So if the politician or the chief executive say yes, we want to buy it, at the end of the day, the administration is not ready to use it. So we can look at turnarounds, crowdsourcing and so on, But I think the fundamental issue is there. What is the change that government needs to go through together with the industry to be able to consume light as a service instead of basically buying infrastructure, which again is used for 20% of its time. That's to me the fundamental question. So the role of the government has to bring back innovation and in-source some of it, but also is to rethink about the way, from a policy and regulatory perspective, technology is deployed, is being consumed, and that has an impact of the quality of life for the citizens.
Yeah. Speaking of light, Leo Paulussen, where are you? Are you near a microphone? Can you get near a microphone? You are in the business of making sure that this city of Amsterdam is lighted. Because you take care that all the lamps are working and you deliver the energy to it, etc. Your views on that?
Yeah, we see the shift from the traditional way of doing infrastructure, and you have to look very well to what the larger consumer, which are the cities, municipalities are wanting. But what we don't see exactly is what the consumers really want. So it's also a shift, what is coming, that a small group is aware that something from the technology point of view is changing, but how we can accelerate that process. So municipalities have an important role in that, and also some suppliers. As grid company, we are also seeing this opportunity to change it, but it's very important that also the consumers are in that process. And so it's important that the people see from different functionalities the opportunity that also the lighting of cities can be done different. They see it because LED lighting is done at home. And then they also have the question, why do we do it in the street or in other ways? So it's that process which is going on, and what we are looking for as company is, where are the really stakeholders who can bring it to the next step? Because as companies who are responsible for return on investment in the end, you have to see also that the process goes uphill to a new position, and there is enough acceleration power in that process. And that's the challenging at this moment as a company to look to those forces who can bring it to the next step. But you have to be part of it. But what is different? In the past we could bring it, we could offer it, that new solutions. But now you have really looked to all the other parties who are part of this process, and in the end, who takes the responsibility for the investment and also for the service in it. So that is coming to what you are saying, that it's the role of municipality, which is completely new, and also from the consumer side, because he has to accept it, but he has also to really want it.
Yeah. Right.
Can I add
Yes, of course.
I think this is a really fundamental point about this is the what do people want question, which is the biggest question obviously out there. The way that we approach that is going to need to change. So if we think about, in the past, municipalities and businesses often led the conversation there. So if we think about that previous mode of planning you described, let's say the 50s style, post-war planning, and we know, say, the city of Los Angeles was allegedly lobbied by General Motors to remove its public tramway system in order to build highways and then, of course, build more traffic on the network, as we might say in a contemporary way.
As for instance, for interruption, the American army influenced German cities to abolish their S-Bahn, but it did not do it. That's why they still have it.
So there are options, right? So, LA had the biggest tramway system in the world at that point, and it was removed very quickly, and they're now unpicking that decision for the next 100 years or so, probably spending billions of dollars putting something back in again. Sydney is the same. Sydney had the second biggest tramway system in the world, and it was removed in 1958, I think, in a couple of years. And they're now trying to put it back in on exactly the same routes that it went down, which will cost billions of dollars again. So we can see this kind of what do people want question is often led. It's, I genuinely don't think there were sort of mass lobbies and movements for we need more highways coming from citizens necessarily at that point. So it's a very nuanced conversation. Equally, you can't ask people what they want necessarily, because people don't know what they can have often. So, again, we can learn a lot from the commercial world there. I don't think Steve Jobs and Apple asked, do you want a little metal box with 1,000 songs on it in your pocket? Because they're like, what are you on about? But then they release the iPod. It suddenly makes perfect sense, and everybody thinks, I do want that. Okay. So there is this kind of leadership of what do people want in the question, and it's something we're very cautious about, particularly when it comes to public bodies, because, of course, they're democratically elected, so they're there in a way to serve the demands or the wishes, the desires of people, but we know that the desires of people are led one way or another. Okay. So we have to get very smart about the way, as Robin said, that we then collaborate between citizens, between businesses, and between government in this very collaborative relationship about where do we need to get to now, because we need to make some serious decisions about it. So we do need to figure out some things. And I often bring up the British architect Cedric Price, who said in the mid-60s, technology is the answer, but what is the question? And he said this 50 years ago, and we still don't really ask this enough, because we jump on a solution because it's there in front of us without stepping back to say, well, hang on, what do we want in the first place? What's this about? What kind of city do we want? Yeah. And we're not very good at having that conversation. So I'd like to understand what is the question, and then we can look at the technologies around us, and we can see, again, in this collaborative mode that Robin and Nick both describe, I think we could probably figure out a way out of it. But we have to change quite radically the way that we work, because citizens aren't going to state very clearly what we want, any more than businesses or municipalities are. It's going to have to be worked out in collaboration.
Yeah. I'd like to bring it then to Amsterdam. Petra Thiel, are you there? Petra is representing business, national business. Well, you can better tell yourself what VNO is called in English, but it's the union of big business in the Netherlands. But you also have been the chairperson of the borough of Amsterdam South, elected by the people. Did you hear this? What did you do right? What did you do wrong then?
Oh my God, it's a question of trust. I'm a public affairs specialist for the Federation of Industrialists in this area. And yes, I'm also a politician for the last 11 years. I'm inspired by all the words, but it goes down to trust. If the municipality has to change, it has to trust private enterprise and give enough space to have the best projects put forward. That means that politicians will have to step aside and give trust to others who have a better idea how everyone can profit. Mind you, this was said last week in a panel talking about the future of Schiphol, that civil servants don't particularly make put the best projects forward to the minister and the ministries. So you're taking the first and second step, and I hope that a lot of people will reproduce these words so that politicians will listen, basically also part of my job. Come up with best practices. And then with the next general elections and the local elections in March 2014, we have a good chance if some of the politicians will give enough space and give enough trust to these projects. This might be a wonderful example, for example. Just the new alderman for economical affairs could say to the municipality and the local council, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do for coming 4 years because I'm going to leave that open to a nice panel of wonderful minds. So if you can do that together, you and me, with Ger, start there.
Okay, that's from a part of Amsterdam. Back to the world.
So I think
trust.
Actually, I think trust is a really interesting question, and I think that with the emergence of the smart cities movement, I guess we can call it, starting in sort of 2008 and thereafter, you saw sort of a honeymoon period whereby companies saw incredible dollar signs with the potential to equip cities with the latest gadgets and widgets and help become problem solvers along with cities. But with that, you had a sort of a wild west of smart cities, if you will. So there was sort of this gold rush in which tons of different companies were all of a sudden approaching cities and overwhelming them with requests to collaborate and to test out different smart city projects. And I think that what we've started to see the end of that honeymoon period in the sense that cities are tired of being bombarded with requests from different companies. And you also see sort of a wariness, I think, whether or not it's true. The example of Rio, which has worked with one company to kind of create a mega command center to manage all of its information and therefore help decision making. I think that there's a perception on behalf of cities that they're worried of getting locked in to working with a single technology service provider. So these are some of the concerns that started to come out of the initial phase of smart cities movement and really bring up some of these trust issues. But I think what you're starting to see now is sort of a smart cities 2.0, where people, cities, and the private sector have recognized that there are these frictions and these sort of weakness in trust. And therefore, we're seeing a new phase. We're starting to see the institutionalization of smart cities. So companies are now aligning themselves and aggregating themselves into groups. So Japan, for example, is one place where this is happening. So 27 Japanese companies have established sort of an aggregated smart cities group. They know that each of them can't provide the entire solution by themselves, but they can each provide a part. And it presents a more coherent package when you're going to ask to work with a city. So it's a little less overwhelming for a city. So you're starting to see sort of this aggregating approach happening, which I think is helpful in rebuilding this question of trust.
Nicola, yeah. Of course. But the problem is that the way we sit, it's very difficult to see who is reacting. But please,
I'd like to react to the question of trust. I think this is very important in a time where trust in our security services is directly undermined. We cannot trust ICT mechanisms. We cannot trust the internet because of government agencies and other major actors undermining this trust. And so I think you sketch a much too optimistic picture of the future. I think our trust is undermined. Our democracy is directly undermined by these actors. And this is a major problem.
Can I react to that? It is a huge problem. However, I would argue that 10 years ago we could all have sat into this room when these issues were not visible yet, and we will have exactly the same conversation. In fact, we did. In 2006, we had an event here, Connected Urban Development, where the main question was, how do we build trust between, at that point, was the public and the private sector. Citizens were not yet into the center of this. So to me, the issue, what you say is accelerating the issue of trust, right? But it's not the regional issue, I think, that we need to look into. The problem to me really is about trust and language. I'll give you an example. And we drew this parallel with the city of Barcelona a few times in the last couple of years. If 3 doctors today from Amsterdam, Barcelona, and Shanghai meet, right? They sit around the table, medical doctors, they know exactly the difference between a heart, a circulatory system, and a heart attack, right? If you take 3 smart city people and you put this from the same cities in the same room, these people do not understand and agree on the difference between a vehicle, a broadband network, and a traffic jam, right? So we don't have the same language, we don't speak the same issues, right? So thinking through defining what the taxonomy maybe of the city is and the language of the city is might mitigate some of the issues with trust. Of course, you have to also solve the other issue, which is much more major. So today, we don't seem to agree on what a smart city is, on what a smart citizen is. We moved from a smart city 7 years ago being object-based discussions, the traffic light talking to the vehicle, and now we swung into say it's pure open innovation, crowdsourcing to the citizens. There's maybe a middle way, which is what we need to think about. Sure. Now, back on the point that you were making on the enterprise and on the businesses and the companies, and maybe simplify here, but I've been working in this space for the last almost 12 years. I used to have hair when I started. And what the IT industry in particular did when we looked first into smart cities, we look into a city as if it was a classic enterprise opportunity. So in a company, in a large corporation, you will talk to the CEO, then the CEO will say, we're going to buy and develop this infrastructure. You will go to the CIO, you will basically provide a proposal, they will buy the infrastructure, you will deploy it. We kind of thought about the same. We said, well, if you talk to the mayor, then we go to the CIO, we're going to deploy specific capability of infrastructure. And we found out that this is not the way it works. I mean, the city is a very entropic environment. When you talk to the mayor, who says the policy, then you talk to the CIO, who does not develop infrastructure. The infrastructure is developed by a developer, who outsource the IT part and the system integration to other companies. So you have to stay engaged in this very complex process for a couple of years before you basically actually go and say something. And IT and large corporations are not used to that complexity. So we all learn somehow that art of staying engaged, understanding the ecosystem and the stakeholders, and being on top of it, and also focusing, in my opinion, on language, developing the common language for a city.
I think it's deeply, deeply complex, because your analogy with the doctors is quite nice, because in a way we know that one of the problems with medicine is that they focus on the heart and the circulatory system, but not so much on the psychology or the neuroscience or the way that people might live their life, which does affect their health. So, and we know that when we're dealing with cities, we are dealing with all of those things. So traffic jam is cultural.
Exactly.
It's not
Social,
literally about moving
vehicles
bits around or organs and blood flow. So there is that big difference when we're dealing with cities. And I think, so your point about trust is important, because it is to do with this new art and science of collaboration, one way or another. We know that trust and respect between citizens, business groups, public sector, and so on is absolutely fundamental starting point for that. And we know that those three groups, one way or another, I mean, they're all citizens at the end of the day. Businesses are also citizens, right? But citizens, business groups, and public sector haven't found a way of collaborating happily necessarily up till now. And it hasn't mattered so much, but it really matters now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there more questions on that around? Do you feel answered? Well,
Maybe
there I
I
have a
can
question.
Go ahead. Nobody addresses the issue that we cannot trust our own governments because they will listen to everything we say.
Okay.
You've
Your statement is there. I keep it in mind.
But I'll briefly, I'll come to it. So, I mean, we know it's an issue. I mean, Morozov is a writer that talks about the way the internet is used by governments in different ways as well. I think the interesting thing about the internet is it also has, to my mind, the seeds of hope and a possible way out of the problem as well, in that it does enable citizens to coordinate directly amongst themselves. So I would actually argue government has a very strong competition at this point for organizing and deciding, which has been the traditional role of government, because citizens now have better tools than the government, actually. So in all of your pockets, there are better tools to communicate, organize, and decide. So I think there is a possibility of a way out of the problem, which is very, very citizen-focused. Morozov would argue that when citizens use those tools, it's easier for governments to spy on them. Still,
Okay.
It's a very valid point, but I do see there's no simple answer there. We can't put the internet back in a box and make it go away again. We have to use those drivers to figure the way out of it.
Everybody could create their own internet. That's why I disagree.
Yeah.
It breaks up into a
Yeah.
million pieces.
Yes. Perhaps it's going to happen, but okay. You have a question or a remark?
Yes, well, just to add another layer onto all of this. So my name's Susan Crawford. I work a lot on internet policy. And perhaps there's a way of thinking of this that it combines competition, as Dan has mentioned, with collaboration. That with true citizen engagement, autonomy, a neighborhood speaking to a local government and a municipality that actually responds, you can create additional trust, a reservoir of trust of government when it needs to take big steps to deal with climate change and other huge problems that citizens among themselves won't be able to solve. Now, so your comments on where you're seeing that use of the smart city to actually create more trusting citizens would be very interesting to me.
Okay, Robin, would you like to comment on that?
So I think that with respect to how you can create a feedback loop of trust, I think it's absolutely true. I think that when you begin to bring in citizens into the equation, and whether you're using a technological platform or whether you're just simply gathering people in a room the old-fashioned style, and you're bringing them in really from the beginning. So from defining a problem space as opposed to reacting to a proposal that's been put up, you really can create sort of a base level of trust. Now, I mean, it's a complicated issue. There are histories involved in creating scenarios of mistrust that are very culturally specific. So, you know, this obviously, I can't speak for every situation, but I definitely have seen sort of success in what Susan was saying.
Dan.
Yeah, I think it's the...
I have
you have a different one?
extra
Okay.
remark, but you have been writing about the Nordic system, which is seen quite a lot as one of the solutions to a lot of problems. If you bring that into reacting to Susan.
Yeah, I used to work in Helsinki at Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund. And while I'm on my organizations, by the way, it's actually Fabrica, not iFabrica, as it says there, just in case anybody's Googling. I don't know what iFabrica is. It's possibly another Apple product that I haven't heard of.
Or will be.
Yeah, exactly. Someone should trademark it. But I used to work in the Finnish Innovation Fund, and we were wrestling with this question of the Nordic model and whether it continues to work in the 21st century, because it is also under the whole series of challenges that other social democratic systems are facing. It clearly works very well around producing a very equal society, which is a primary driver, which is entirely right, I think, for that context, and high quality education, healthcare services, municipal services, and so on. And for many years, I think, while Finland, where I was very Finnish, was very homogeneous in terms of its population diversity, it really did work. What's interesting now is that Helsinki is diversifying rapidly. It's one of the most rapidly diversifying capitals in Europe. It's jumping from 7 to 15% non-Finnish in the next 5 to 10 years. And that begins to then throw up all kinds of interesting questions, because it means that, say, the planning department can no longer assume the same kind of cultural sensibilities that it used to be able to assume. And I'd argue that throughout the 90s and 2000s, it's often been planning Helsinki, kind of imagining a 1980s Finn as their target group. And that's changed quite radically. So what we saw on the streets of Helsinki was very interesting in the 2 years we were there. Movements like Ravintolapäivä, this pop-up restaurant day, which was started by 3 people who found it so difficult to set up a small cafe, because the amount of regulations the forms you had to fill in was this thick, and all in Finnish. Unnecessarily, I might add. You could probably get away with this number of forms for the same regulation, but anyway. And so they thought, well, rather than keep hitting our head against that brick wall, why don't we just say, we'll have a pop-up restaurant day. Us and all of our friends will open a pop-up restaurant on next Saturday. What's the worst that could happen? Like, we can't all be arrested. If more than 50 of us do it, we'll be safe. And that's what happened. So it ran, and there were pop-up restaurants all over Helsinki on this Saturday. It was amazing. Now it runs every 4 months. It's spread to 40 different countries worldwide, this phenomenon. And there are several hundred pop-ups happen whenever this happens in Helsinki. And the streets come alive, and you see, my neighbor was an Argentinian woman in the next block who I had no idea there was an Argentinian woman even in Helsinki. And she was selling empanadas out of her window, lowering them down to the street in a basket. You'd put €3 in the basket, she'd pull the basket back up. She's making it in her kitchen.
Yeah.
Totally.
We have a movie on that, right?
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Shall we watch?
Well, if you can find the movie,
if you can find the movie called Dan.
It's in there's in a PowerPoint slide, maybe.
In the PowerPoint slide called Dan.
So the key point about this is that it's illegal. But it's also really good. Yeah. And so you have this kind of tension there. It's illegal in that they don't have the license to cook food in their kitchen and serve it to the street. But there are hundreds of them doing it.
Something's going to happen, I believe.
No, maybe not. Yeah. So the little movie I think you might see is... okay. That's an egg and bacon muffin being lowered to the street.
Helsinki empanadas.
Yeah. And you put €3 in the basket, and...
I got lots of dandelions.
That's my son.
I got lots of dandelions.
So she lifts the basket back up. It's got €3 in it. She lowers the food down and so on. And this spread like wildfire. It was incredible. All coordinated through Facebook. And then they built in a hackathon, as you described, actually, Robin. In 4 days, 2 days, one weekend, they built 4 mobile apps to handle this thing across, BlackBerry, Apple, Android, and Windows Phone for some reason. I don't know why they bothered, but anyway. And imagine, again, the procurement process for if the municipality tried to make 4 mobile apps. And maybe you were talking about a 3-month request for tender, request for proposal process, and then maybe 3 months of build. I don't know. So we were not comparing like with like. It's not fair to compare a municipality's procurement process with what I just showed you. But the problem is that citizens don't care about comparing like with like at this point. They can get a mobile app which shows you where a pop-up restaurant is in 10 meters, describing empanadas for €3.
They can rate how good the food is?
Yeah, they leave comments, everything is there. Of course, it works exactly how you'd expect, because it's like I said, Minister, we're building the website like Twitter builds Twitter. We know what these things look like now, how they should work. It's done, it's easy. The challenge then is how does the municipality respond? And what was interesting was that in the Nordic context, you hadn't seen this kind of active citizenship in the same way. You'd see that in Italy. Because people try to figure their way around the morass of laws and bureaucracy, and they're very active as a result. So you have active government and active citizens. Often in Helsinki, citizens have been quite passive because the services were so good for so many years. The public services were so extraordinarily good that no one had to try to do anything, actually. Now, what was happening was the diversifying, and then also this kind of increased demand from citizens, different kinds of food. Helsinki now is one of the most interesting food scenes in Europe, which is an unthinkable statement 5, 10 years ago. But it's absolutely true. More innovative in many ways than Italy, for instance, which has an amazing food culture. So that's happened in a matter of years, and it's been led by citizens using the tools that I said. They just off the shelf. We'll use Facebook, we'll make an app. There's no organization behind it in the traditional sense. So it's very difficult for the city of Helsinki to say, actually, even who do we talk to about this? Because there's nothing there. And they couldn't arrest anybody because it would be the worst PR disaster in the world for a start. But there's no one really to arrest except your own citizens. It's just a kind of it's code. It's a series of instructions saying, set up a pop-up, do it safely, close at the end of the day. And you can't arrest code. So what was interesting about the dynamics of that, actually, it's the same dynamics you also see in Occupy, in protest movements and so on, using similar tools in similar ways, completely different drivers, of course. But that's the challenge I was talking about earlier when I said that governments have competition. Citizens can start organizing themselves. Equally, we see businesses like Uber, for instance, which is increasingly successful private hire company, which will put the taxi business out of business, for sure, within a couple of years.
Right.
And so what was previously a big part of the civic infrastructure, taxis, very regulated and so on, and well understood, icons of the city, are now shifting to this very simple app-based private sector solution. So we're seeing all of these things beginning to kind of eat into what a government traditionally used to do in the city. And that's my starting point was, what does the city do at this point? What kind of city do we want? And then how do we use the strengths of private sector, citizens, and the public working together in this new collaborative mode to produce that?
Susan, you now have seen this movie of Liberation in Helsinki. Your last book, however, is about the captivity Americans are in their telecommunications subscription, and how cities who try to free their citizens from that worked against. So,
well,
how's this working out in America?
Well, thank you for the plug for a captive audience. I appreciate that. That's why I'm here. I'm visiting Amsterdam and Stockholm to find out how you guys did this better than my country is able to do it. And Cisco is collaborating with a wonderful project to bring fiber to Israel in a terrific business model that I hope we can adopt in the United States. So I see all these issues are intertwined with very high capacity, inexpensive access to all citizens, with autonomous, brave city civil servants who understand how to collaborate with people outside, with local journalists who can actually report on how the city is doing, made possible by this fiber capacity, we can have a much healthier set of cities around the world. But we're still at a very primitive stage in putting all of these pieces together. So I'm glad to bring up the subject of incumbent control of telecommunications, because it's as if the street grid of the city had been handed over to a few gatekeepers who were deciding in America what conversations were interesting and which would not be heard. And for a great city, like my home city of New York, that seems like a very short-sighted way to bring us into the 21st century.
Robin, you live there.
I do.
So you're captive.
I do not feel captive, but actually, I think the one thing that I would like to mention is that we've been talking a lot about technology as an enabler, but there are some phenomenal examples of this type of citizen inclusion without technology. And one of those that I want to mention is in Ahmedabad, India, which is one of the poorest places that you can imagine, and there are a lot of slum communities there. So communities without, talk about not even having the internet, they don't have water and basic sanitation. But there's actually an incredible new way of pooling resources amongst citizens together in what we call sort of meta finance. It's not microfinance, it's not municipal finance, but it's actually the community getting together, deciding the infrastructure that they need, pooling their funds. These aren't bankable people. So they actually work with a third-party NGO who acts as a credit agency and then goes to the bank, which enables a loan, and then the municipality, once this slum community is recognized as a legal entity by the bank, actually kicks in the remaining funding. So it's sort of, it's pooled finance for infrastructure, and it's not technology enabled, but it's another example of how citizens are working with municipalities in new ways and how they're participating in new ways to bring new service, to actually receive new services. So I think it's important to recognize that we can go beyond just technology. We don't, it's not necessary necessarily.
Okay, right. Nicola, have you to add to that?
No, I've been in this country for the last 15 years, and I always got fascinated about the broadband discussions. In fact, I would like to take some credit and claim the fact that part of the discussion in the Netherlands about fiber to the home was born through a trip that was made to Milan to visit Fastweb, which was this fiber to the home program that we had in the middle of the 90s. That's how I started to get engaged into my cities, by the way. The difference that we had is, Italy comes up with lots of ideas, but we lack the execution capabilities. The Dutch basically saw these ideas. There was a government, remember, program aimed at stimulating fiber to the home investments by cities. The whole thing basically created a whole movement across the country that basically became the reference for countries like Singapore or like Korea. So it's always like this chain effect. So where are these ideas being born? Who industrializes the process, and basically who leverages from what is being done? So that's one part of the equation. So I will argue, smart cities were started in Italy, although our cities are not very smart at the moment. The last part is a couple of years ago, I was meeting with the Minister of IT in China, the MIT minister, and I handed over my card to him, and he sees Amsterdam, and he said, "Oh yeah, we've been looking in this project called CityNet." Oh, yeah. So this gentleman is in charge of defining the technical specification of about 100 cities of 1 million people which are being built in China. And I was thinking, what an opportunity is this for Amsterdam, for the Netherlands? And we don't even know about this, right? So many of the ideas which are being developed, maybe taken from the Italians, but developed in this country, are being taken as a reference in many parts of the world. And from an economic development perspective, this is a unique asset that I think this country and this city has, which should be leveraged maybe much more than what it is now.
I think in terms of citizens as well, I mean, as I understand it, if I remember from the mid-90s, the Digital Stadt project in Amsterdam was...
That was a great one.
Right, I mean, I was in Manchester at the time working with something called the Northern Quarter Network, which was urban regeneration in the north of the city, 94, 95, and we built a digital network, and we thought we were the first city-based digital network in Europe, and then we looked and realized, I don't know, this Digital Stadt was there first.
Well, you're welcome. I think in January we'll celebrate 20 years of history of it.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, there's as well as the fiber, the infrastructure level, which is fundamental enabler.
Yeah.
There's also evidence of this working with smart citizens here for a very long time. Citizen-led cultural project, essentially.
I'd love to have asked Walter Hoogland, who signed this document, I think 25 years ago, that brought the internet about to be, I think, because you liberated huh?
Not the internet.
Well, the use of it.
The World Wide Web, yes.
Yeah.
It's made into the public domain. That's correct.
That was I think it was the start that the citizen could use the internet. So, do you have any last remarks? Because Ger is nearing us, which means that we have few time.
Yeah. No, it was not citizens, but scientists, I should say, that started the whole process. And I think it's an important message that citizens are important, but scientists actually are paving the way. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened here. While I was thinking when listening, I listened also to the remark of my neighbor here. I think there is, and I understand that there is a wave of optimism that is presented by the speakers here, and I'm easy in following this wave of optimism. On the other hand, we are walking on a one-dimensional, in one dimension, and there are many different dimensions. One has already mentioned culture. There are all kinds of legal issues. There are many other questions that come into play when thinking about the way internet, the World Wide Web can make progress. And despite all the marvels of the World Wide Web, one still has to realize that many of the things that we hope it could bring are not brought about. And
or not yet.
Well, yeah. So you have to be. So you have to, let's say, to moderate your. Well, you should be optimistic, but at the same time, you should be well aware of the limitations of the technology and the gap between what people can do and what they actually do.
Okay, Walter, thank you. I think you have set the agenda for part of the rest of the day. Ger, you're, I think, about to close, so
Any
I think
final
I
remarks
hand
of the
the
people
microphone
on
to you.
stage, or you said what you wanted to say?
Yeah, and maybe one last comment. You know, Dirk, that I'm very focused on this idea. Now, I'm looking at the last hour, and I'm looking at this room, and I want to be a bit provocative. I learned to be provocative by the Dutch, right? I would argue this conversation should not happen only with the people in this room. I would argue there is probably a group of 18 to 25 years old people, right? They use the internet and understand the internet much more than what we do. We should be in those type of conversations. We keep having, in my opinion, we've been having it for the last 15 years, a conversation amongst people that we know. It's all of us more or less coming together. We are not involving the people that really are doing things and developing stuff and living this life that we speak about, right? We are digital migrants, but the digital natives, to me, should be part of the conversation next time.
Great.
And to the point about, you know, a constructive critique, I think it's fundamentally important right now because there is I'd say there's actually less optimism around smart cities at this point than at other points in the last 8 years, funnily enough, because it hasn't happened. And there's lots of reasons why it hasn't happened, and often very good reasons why it hasn't happened so far. We can also see lots of on-the-ground experiments beginning to bubble up. But that means it is the right time to apply the constructive critique. And I'd say, if you want my essay, Smart Citizens, not to give a plug, but is basically a critique of the movement and pointing out the issues with the approaches so far. So I think that there are a bunch of voices beginning to be heard. The London School of Economics Electric City Conference last December was a great conference because those voices came to the fore from people like Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen, as well as an emerging set of researchers elsewhere. So I think that there is a good critique happening in the movement as well, and maybe we should have brought it out more on the stage. And finally, I'd say scientists are citizens too.
Yes.
I think I'll just end on a note that I think it's a really good thing that ideas spread as quickly and rapidly as they do, because as the gentleman definitely pointed out, there are legal issues. There are instances when the same social media technologies that create good and create citizen involvement also create civil unrest and problems and riots and things like that. But the good news is that because ideas spread more quickly and because people are so inspired by some of these ideas, and Amsterdam says, I want to have that idea that Barcelona has, and vice versa, people get to work on these issues before they encounter all the legal issues and so forth. So I think that the inspiration, it's what's most important to keep sort of the fire alive and keep people trying and working through these issues.
There's hope for humanity. Thank you.
There is.